So, what do you think of the new studio backdrop?
Ugh, you are so old.
I'm not that old.
Yeah, right.
I'm not?
Well, sure. I mean, to super old people, you're not old. To normal people, you're old.
So, who is normal in this situation?
I don't know, like 18 to 35-year-olds.
Okay, let me help you out with something right now. Those are not normal people. Those are walking advertisements for male cosmetics and adventure weekends on a quarterly basis to places like Machu Picchu and Icelandic volcanoes.
You really want them to like you, don't you?
I really do. Maybe if I grow like a handlebar mustache and start wearing suspenders.
The point is, you're not cool anymore.
Okay. I think my 45 Instagram followers would beg to differ.
It's like this. You don't get it at all.
Yes, I do.
Right. Okay. What was the last podcast you listened to?
My last podcast. Serial. It was that podcast about the kid who was accused of killing his girlfriend. I think that came out in, I don't know, maybe 4 years ago.
Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. And what are you watching on Netflix right now?
On Netflix. Star Trek. The Next Generation. What? That doesn't mean anything. Okay, I'm old. So what?
So you don't get it.
What is there to get?
Well, a completely different worldview. You don't see the world the same way, and so you struggle to understand how they see it.
Well, if some of these other worldviews didn't just so casually throw away rationale and logic, I would understand them just fine.
Get off my lawn. Kids these days. Am I right?
What's happening right now?
You know, back in my day, we didn't have fancy things like YouTube. We just cut a hole in a box and pretended we were on TV.
Oh, I get it. This is supposed to be me.
Get a haircut. Why don't you get a job?
I have a job.
The files are in the computer? Hey, dude, you want to listen to this sweet mixtape that I made last night?
That's funny. By the way, I have some awesome mixtapes.
Real quick, where can I print out the directions from MapQuest?
Okay, you know none of this means anything.
You better have a good plan.
A plan for what?
For understanding other worldviews. Or the world is just going to pass you by.
I don't want. That's not.
Yeah. And then the cool, normal people will never like you.
Why can't they just see all the awesomeness right here?
Maybe give it time. It probably doesn't help that you're imitating these gimmicks that are 7 years old on YouTube. Also, maybe try watching some of the newer Netflix shows.
Okay, I'll watch some new shows. I mean, they're all so dark, right?
I know. I guess unrealistically pretty people living out some pretty dark narratives is what's in right now. I don't know. Hello, and welcome back to the Denver Church of Christ weekly recap. I am Chris Zillman. It's great to have you back with us, and there's been a lot going on. I mean, this whole year, there's been a lot going on. We've all been dealing with for some time the global pandemic and the quarantine that's happened as a result of the global pandemic. And those two things are actually kind of separate events now in our minds, because we have one thought about the illness and the virus and the threat that it brings. But then we have created a whole other world that the quarantine has brought. And even now, as the quarantine is lifting and some of the regulations are lifting, we're all terrified of there being a rebound in the virus that brings the quarantine right back to where it was. And life under the quarantine, there are some great blessings to it, but there are a myriad of challenges. And so those two things, which are linked together, have been affecting our lives and making life quite stressful. But then on top of that, both of those events have created kind of a global economic crisis. Unemployment is up and everyone worries about what's going to go on with the economy. Those people who have families who are worried about losing their jobs, those people who are wanting to retire who don't know if they can now. And that creates another level of stress that goes beyond just living in quarantine and living with the fear of the virus. And then obviously the most pressing thing that's going on right now that has almost made those three subjects something in our rearview mirror is how we as a country and as a church are going to deal with social injustice, the ones that we've been living with. And I don't think anybody is walking away from what's been going on satisfied or even super hopeful. Although I do think that there is a window for great change to happen, I think there's a ton of angst. And all of these things are interlinked when you think about what kind of environment it has created in our country, in our world, in our church, in our neighborhoods, in our homes. And I think for me, something that always becomes prevalent to me in stressful situations is just the inability of, especially Americans, I mean, this is where I live, of our inability to have rational and reasonable discourse about subjects that are contentious in nature. And right now is a perfect example of us just having a great inability to discuss differing opinions intelligently. You know, as Americans, we've developed a pretty peculiar notion about discourse. We speak and proclaim and talk as though two things can't be true at the same time, or as though two conflicting views can't both be true at the same time, depending on the situation. Which, if you believe that two things can't be true at the same time, it makes a fact of the idea that anybody that disagrees with you is an enemy. And now we treat anybody who has a different view from us as though they are an enemy, as though they are hateful, as though they're trying to harm us, as though we need to protect ourselves from them. And this in turn has made discussions about race, about gender, about generational differences contentious at best, but in most moments it's made it absolutely toxic. We have to do better. We've got to find different ways to discuss these things. You know, one of my favorite two verses in the Bible, which are back to back, is in Proverbs. And these two verses are dealing with two things at the same time. The first is essentially, what do we do when we're arguing with a fool? When we're talking to someone who's just straight up foolish, how do we deal with that person? And so these two verses strive to answer that question. And in Proverbs 26, verse 4, it says this: "Do not answer a fool according to his folly, or you will be like him yourself." And we've seen that when someone is acting the fool, we cannot rise to the bait. We cannot treat them the same way that they are treating the subject. Otherwise, we ourselves become a fool, just like them. All right, that makes total sense. The next verse says this: "Answer a fool according to his folly, or he will be wise in his own eyes." And so this verse seems to say exactly the opposite. If you answer a fool in kind, he will see how foolish he is being. He will think he's wise until you answer him in the same way that he is dealing with the situation. And so these two verses seem to contradict one another. But I think what's occurring here is two things. One is trying to answer the question of how we deal with fools, but I think it's also pointing out that two things can be true at the same exact time, depending on the situation. In one situation, you would not answer a fool according to his folly, but in a different situation, though you're still dealing with a fool, you would answer a fool according to his folly. And this has a lot to do with the way that people look at things like race, like gender, like generational differences, is that it's possible for people of different worldviews to have differing opinions on this and neither of them to be wrong. And we do a terrible job with that. And so what I would like to propose here, I'm going to nerd out on you a little bit. And I have, since the beginning of the quarantine, I think we've all probably found shows to watch. We have a little bit of extra time, or there's things that we used to do with our free time that we can no longer do. We can't play sports, we can't go to restaurants. And so, you know, our free time that we do have, we're kind of using in different ways. And one of the things that I started doing is I started rewatching a series that I loved as a younger man. And the series is Star Trek: The Next Generation. All right, now, hold on. Many of you may remember it, and maybe you remember it as being hokey, and certainly it was started to get made in 1989. And if you started watching in 1987. If you started watching in 1987, the special effects are hokey. Even the dialogue at times is hokey. But here's the thing. The show endeavors to tackle higher-minded issues by creating a fictional context for them. And here's the reason why they do that. Because we are emotional about our present-day contexts. One that people were emotional about for a long time, and still are, it was the issue of terrorism. Like, how do we deal with terrorism and terrorists? And some people were okay with torture. Some people wanted to be way more diplomatic. Some people wanted to ask questions like, why do they hate us? And to some people, it didn't matter. They were killing people, and we need to deal with them. And listen, and the arguments that took place around these issues were violent at times. And so what a show like Star Trek: The Next Generation does is it would take an issue of terrorism and put it into a completely fictional context so that we can look at it objectively, non-emotionally, without a whole lot of personal connection to the issue. And it's funny, when you put it into a hyper-fictional context like that, you see it from a completely different perspective. So, Star Trek: The Next Generation is a science fiction show. It's about a group of people who are on a large spaceship exploring the galaxy, and they make connections with alien races all over the place. And here's the thing, is you very quickly realize that in their attempting to connect with these alien races, they are constantly coming up with foreign worldviews. It challenges their own mores, and also asks the questions, is it okay for those mores to be different? For this worldview to think this about the subject and this to think that, and for in their own context, for those opposing worldviews to be immoral. But when they come together, they have to allow for differing views, or they're never going to get along. And so Star Trek: The Next Generation is always kind of dealing with this, and it's kind of this high-minded philosophy that it's dealing with. I would definitely recommend watching some fiction or reading some fiction, because it takes some of our most valued and emotional topics and puts it into a context in which we can look at objectively. All right, and so that's what I've been doing, and it's been helping me to kind of. It's almost been a bit of a therapy in dealing with some of these very emotional, some of these very contentious subjects that our country has been dealing with. And by the way, we still have a presidential election ahead of us. And, if anything in America, if America's taught us anything in the last, number of years, it's that we're not going to be super mature when it comes to this issue either. And so I have found watching these fictional shows has been helping me to kind of process some of these very personal matters and to look at it more objectively. My point in bringing this up is that is what we have to do. We have to be able to hold two truths at the same time and realize that they may not have to be mutually exclusive, that they could be true for one person and true for another person, and both of them have to accept that. And I do think that's what Proverbs is pointing out, is that not everything is right for every single situation, that it could be right for one person in one situation, but wrong for another person in the same situation. We have to be able to hold these worldviews, and we have to be able to talk about them and not treat one another as the enemy if there is a difference of opinion. And there are going to be many differences of opinion if we're choosing to live in a diverse environment like our church, where there is a plurality of histories, of ethnicities, of personal mores, and we're blending them together. And hey, by the way, on top of all that, we're all sinful. And so you put that together, we have got to leave room for differences. We have got to leave room for understanding and giving space for understanding and allowing people to hold those views without trying to attack them, without trying to change them, without going after them as though they're morally wrong. We have to do better. We have to be better listeners. We have to be better conversationalists. We have to be less impulsive in our arguments so that we don't intentionally give offense because someone disagrees with us. It's the only way we're going to get through this and learn from one another and come out on the other end wiser. Come out on the other end as a place where people feel welcomed to be here, where it's okay to be different, where it's okay to have different views, but where you also have to understand that you have to be open to your views being wrong or your views being challenged. We want that to be a normative conversation. I think Proverbs teaches us this. I think this is the end of wisdom, is being able to hold these different views and examine them and have these conversations with one another in a way that doesn't alienate, in a way that doesn't marginalize, certainly in a way that doesn't disassociate someone from our family. So anyway, those are my thoughts this week. Thank you so much for watching Weekly Recap. Look forward to seeing you next week. Stay safe out there. Love one another. Be patient with one another. And right now, we just need to show great kindness to one another and extend a lot of grace. Love you guys. Thank you for watching. We'll see you soon.